Hey y'all, welcome to this week's episode of Race Kiki with Jonathan Lee. I'm your host, Jonathan, but you already knew that. Anyway, this week I have the opportunity to speak with my friend Caroline Falby. She's an incredible artist and a professor. She's Canadian. She taught me something about benevolent racism. Messy. She explains Canada to me and race relations there. She explains transitioning into US. She explains maneuvering in a rich white lady world and all of the movement and what have you. Y'all, they hire tutors to get these kids into elite schools, otherwise they're garbage. Uh, Whew. Anyway, remember, we can't fix a problem we're afraid to talk about. So let's dig into this conversation with my incredible friend Caroline. Be amazing.
Oh, okay. I'm like, uh-oh.
Welcome to Race Kiki, Carolyn.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thanks for joining me. I'm excited to have this conversation with you. And I know we were doing a little talking before I started recording, so let's not waste any time.
Okay.
When did you learn about race?
That's a really tough question for me. So I grew up, I don't know if you know this, but I'm Canadian.
Uh-huh.
So I grew up in Toronto, and I grew up in a community that was very affluent and predominantly white.
Mm-hmm.
And so my exposure to people who didn't really look like me was very minimal. And when I mean like people who didn't look like me, I mean like people who were not blonde. Yeah, I mean, it's like, even within my family, there were these like notions of like immigrants, like this idea of like what made a Canadian, right?
Uh-huh.
And that being this kind of like baseline, right?
Okay.
And it wasn't until fairly recently, like maybe 10 years ago, I realized that my identity as like a white Anglophone, because it's like because also in Canada, privilege is also connected to language.
Mm-hmm.
And so being a Canadian like WASP Anglophone,
Mm-hmm.
that to me was like the baseline of what an English Canadian looked like.
Mm-hmm.
And in Canada, I felt like there's they talk about how liberal Canada is and with their immigration laws and stuff.
Right.
But it's sort of, I think, this kind of benevolent racism.
Mm-hmm. I know.
So this idea, it's like very like, we're going to welcome all these refugees, but it's also sort of like, you're coming into our space.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think as a kid, I always felt like, oh, like this person is my friend, but they're coming into my space. Mm-hmm. So like, and it makes it more difficult for me to actually talk about the subject with my Canadian friends who are of color mm-hmm. than in the United States. Because my experience there is of somebody of privilege, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And that also recognizing that my interactions with them when I was younger were framed by this idea of like, especially because in Canada, we have this whole notion of the multicultural mosaic, the cultural mosaic, which is this idea that the country itself is made up of all these different cultures. So it's not a melting pot. When you come to Canada, you retain your language and you retain your identity. And this is to the point where, like, as a kid, if like you have Greek parents, you can go to Greek school on Saturdays and like get school credit for like maintaining your identity. So people usually like maintain their parents' language. But for that reason, I think in some ways that sounds like a really great like notion. And when I first moved to the States, I really was like, oh, the US, this idea that everyone should like lose their identity is terrible. And like that, but at the same time, not really recognizing that I was brought up in this culture that where I just had access to things because of my privilege and because of the way I looked and because I didn't have this immigrant identity or so I would say that like most of my experiences with race as a child were with I mean there is like a a population, a Black population in Canada that's been there since the American Revolution, which is like when as long as my family's been there, but it's very small. So like the majority of people I came into contact with were children of immigrants.
Okay.
So that also is like a little bit different than I think in the States, that relationship, which is something that I find is really interesting about the States, is that there's this idea here that Blackness is like homogenized there. And there's not this really recognition that within that community, there's a lot of different ethnicities and different languages and different cultures.
The idea of Blackness for most white Americans is if you start to unpack it, you get into that uncomfortable notion of slavery, which immediately makes white people uncomfortable. So we change the subject. And that is part of the reason why we're looked at as a monolith. It's easier to say, well, you're Black, so this is the way I'm going to treat you because it's the way I've treated all Black people that I've ever met. This is the way my father treated Black people, my grandfather, my so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So it's a subject that is very, very sticky when we get into the meat and potatoes of it, but it really isn't, because if we just talk our way through it or talk our way towards something, I didn't know a lot of the things that you shared with me, but I assume, this is just me assuming, when you got to America, when did you get to America?
1994.
Okay, so when you got to America, blonde, white woman with some coins in her purse, I'm sure that you were welcomed into white middle class society quite easily.
Yes, but also what's really interesting is my experience coming to New York at the same time, because it was 1994.
Okay.
Was that I was in a dorm where two of my roommates were Black.
Okay.
And my third roommate was Korean.
Okay.
So I was actually, I didn't really know very many white people when I moved to New York, which like completely changed my experience. I was like the white girl, but I also was able to, my foreignness allowed me to actually sort of blend in. So I was able to, so I had all that privilege, but I also felt like I was given a pass in some ways. My foreignness gave me a pass, where it would be like, we'd have these conversations where people would be like, well, white people are like this, but Caroline's Canadian, so she's not.
Yeah,
she's not white.
She's not this part.
But in reality, it's like, I have to keep on reminding my friends. It's like, but in reality, like if you look at actually my ancestry, the majority of my ancestors came to Canada during the American Revolution. So they were Americans, and many of them, I'm sure, owned slaves. In fact, like I know, like my great like generations ago grandfather who immigrated to Canada, his cousin moved to the southern United States and fought in the Confederate Army and had slaves. So like maybe not my direct descendants, but also like most of my direct descendants were like Dutch and came from like New York State. So I'm pretty sure they did, right? But also in Canada, we pretend that this legacy of slavery does not exist there.
Right.
In a way of, I think Canada really likes to position itself in negation to the US. So it's only until BLM a couple of years ago, because, you know, Canada always kind of like follows the US in terms of these things, like in terms of consciousness, that there were really only these conversations now happening about slavery in the US. So there have been conversations about Indigenous history and truth and reconciliation in the last like 20 years, but not really about race. Like I was raised to think that we didn't have slavery in Canada. So I was like taught that in school, like Canada didn't have slavery. This was something that existed in the US, which is just not true. Like it was, yeah, it's not true at all. And also with this sort of mythology that, you know, African-American slaves escaped the United States to Canada and found freedom, and like this whole like narrative, right? And the reality is like they came to a country that was still segregated. And, you know, if you go to like Nova Scotia, there's like the historic community of Black Canadians that can trace their ancestors to escaped enslaved people. Like their community was like torn down. It doesn't exist anymore. So it was like erased by the entire, like by the city. And when people first came to Canada, they actually were forced to live in the woods. Like people lived in like holes. Like they weren't welcomed. Like,
I did not know that.
Yeah, like there's actually, I was listening, like, and like I was saying, like, you know, I think like a lot more, like I was listening to something in last summer by a woman who's trying to, you know, preserve these spaces, especially in Nova Scotia, because there's a large Black community there that's descendant from enslaved Americans. Well, not Americans, but enslaved people. And just talking about how, you know, when people moved there, they were given, I think they were given actual land, but it wasn't, I'm not sure if they were even deeded the land. But they had nothing. So they basically dug holes and like formed these like rudimentary like places to live. And that's like, yeah, you know, so it's like this whole notion of, I think like, you know, there's a lot of anti-Americanism in Canada. So it's like framing itself as like this utopia, and this whole conversation about race is something that I was brought up into. So that sort of in some ways like enforced my prejudice and my implicit bias, because it was like, my people didn't do this thing, which is not true. And then also, you know, and then also like, I can't have this conversation with you about race because it has nothing to do with me. You know, like, but at the same time, like I'm still benefiting from all of these, like of being the descendant of a colonizer, right?
Yes.
Because even my relatives who didn't come from the States came from, you know, Great Britain and were given land that belonged to other people.
Yes. They took land that belonged to other people. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where did you go to school when you came here?
I went to Parsons.
Okay.
And I did a degree at the New School at the same time.
Oh, fancy.
Yeah. So actually I have 2 undergraduate degrees because I did 2 at the same time. So I actually did one of my undergraduate degrees in post-colonial theory. So I was reading a lot of like, yeah, so it's like I came here and I was like reading Frantz Fanon and like Edward Said and like, you know, and all those people like, like,
now,
so
when you were studying this in school, did you have moments where your mind was just blown and you had to step away from the text just to digest it?
Not really. Actually, I think the thing that was most striking to me is in reading all this stuff, like this post-colonial theory, was because there was already a conversation happening in Canada about Indigenous history.
Okay.
And truth and reconciliation. It hadn't really happened yet, but most of my friends who are in college in Canada were taking classes that like they were talking about these issues. And I was also at the time, I don't know who gave me these books, but I was reading a lot of fiction by Indigenous writers living in Canada. And so like, what was most striking to me was that this narrative about colonialism that was being taught to me by predominantly like white men at the new school. Like I did have some teachers who weren't white. And actually, we should talk about that because that actually I have a funny story about that. But like in terms of like reading that stuff, it was really striking to me. I remember having a meeting with the department and them talking, because it was really smart departments. They were like, give us feedback on this. And I was like, well, why aren't we talking about like Americans' relationship to Indigenous people, like that we live in a colonized country? And they were just like, what? Like, I don't understand what you're talking about. Like, we're not a colonial country. And I was like,
what?
Like, I was like, we really need some classes on like Indigenous history in the US. And they were like, well, I think there's somebody who like teaches that somewhere. And so that was like really striking to me, because I was like, we're reading all this stuff about like France and England and Africa and India and like all of this stuff, but not even really thinking about like the US. But okay, so my one really uncomfortable race moment, undergraduate, and this is embarrassing but hilarious at the same time. Okay. So like I had no knowledge of all about Black history in the US. Like none. Like, I mean, I had learned about like Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
But even like, I don't remember why I had this impression, but as a child, I like thought of him as being sort of a dangerous person. I'm not sure why. But like, you know, saw him as being like this sort of radical. And I don't remember anyone telling me that, but having this feeling about it. So, but that was like the extent, right? And it was all framed in this, like the US had the civil rights movement and these horrible things that they did and segregation. We didn't have these things, but like, you should know how terrible the US is. So that was like the framing for me, but that was like the limitedness of it, right? So then I came here and I had a class, and I wish I could remember the name of the professor, but I had like my first Black professor.
Okay.
So like, I had never really had, I'm trying to remember. I mean, I might've had some Black teachers in like elementary school and high school, but not like significant teacher, right? So I had this teacher, and I think it was like a cultural studies class. And she had us read an article by W.E.B. Du Bois, and I had never heard of him before. And so I had to write this essay like about my thoughts about this article. And so I wrote the whole article talking about how like progressive I thought he was and his thoughts. Not realizing that he was a Black man. So it wasn't until later I realized like I had written this like 3-page essay about this dude, like probably like one of the best known like civil rights fighters in the US. And I had written it entirely thinking he was like this really like, this white dude's like really and she gave me a C. I can't believe she didn't fail me. I was just like, oh my God. I was so embarrassed. Yeah, my friends still tease me about that. But it shows how gouch my knowledge was, right?
Oh, that's funny. See, I'm doing the math in my head, and I think you and I are somewhere in the same season.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you my when did I learn about race? It's a story I tell all the time. When I was in the 3rd grade, I went to 3rd grade in Natchez, Mississippi. And Natchez, Mississippi is where you would go buy all your designer slaves during slavery. Well, one of the places. And my 3rd grade teacher was this white woman. And she took a classroom filled with Black students to a working plantation.
Okay.
And we were greeted by a white woman hoop skirt, the whole Southern idea that you would imagine.
Yeah.
The Black children, us Black kids, were not allowed in the main house. We trailed all the way around. We went to the slave quarters where there were Black people dressed as slaves. And the white teacher looks at the Black students and said, "See, children, your people were here and they were happy."
Oh my God.
That's my first memory of race.
Oh my God. I mean, like, it's funny because it's like, I think that's like a stereotype of the South to me, like growing up.
And this was
But
probably,
it's like, it just amazes me every time I hear shit like this. Like, it's
if
just like,
I was like
so,
8 years old, this
yeah,
had to have been 1980.
yeah.
This was like,
But also, so my question to you, like in your community, like aside of like a teacher, because this is something that I notice here too with my kids in school, is that and because like I work in the public schools, this position of like white women, especially being in like, and I'm one of them, right? Like when I go into a classroom in the Bronx or something, I'm like the white lady, right? And they're in this position of power. And how do you relate to these children? But like a lot of these kids, like outside of the classroom, they don't really have much interaction with white people either. So I would ask you, like, when you were like growing up, was that like the only like white person you were interacting with? Or like, were there other people within your community?
we moved around a lot when I was a child. Most of my family's circle of influence were family members, so people who looked like me. And family went to church a lot, so the church looked like me. Generally speaking, depending on the state we were in, most of the teachers looked exactly like you. Most of the teachers were white women. And in some cases, I went to predominantly white schools. And when I was in predominantly white schools, I got a really, really, really good education. When I went to predominantly Black schools, I got a decent education, but the only reason why I was exceptional at that education is because I'd already been taught that information at white schools. When I was in the 9th grade, I was being taught the same lesson I had learned in the 6th grade. And in the 6th grade, I was living in Washington State, being educated in a predominantly white school. When I went back to Mississippi, I was in a predominantly, all Black school, being educated by all Black teachers.
I mean, that's like a really interesting thing to me too, like having kids in the New York City public school system here, because I made a really conscious decision when they went into middle school to send them to a Black school. So my kids for elementary school we were living in Park Slope, so you gotta get that says enough, right? So we were living in Park Slope, and they were at a school that was predominantly white. And predominantly, very privileged. And and then I was like going and working, teaching these art programs in the Bronx and in Harlem, and like out in like East Flatbush and stuff, and realizing like when I would go into, this is one of the things I noticed, the biggest difference between these schools was that in my kids' school, if a boy acted out, the teacher's response would be, "Oh, he's being assertive. He must be very smart. We need to engage him more. We need to offer him more," right? And this is regardless actually of the race of the teacher, I'm gonna say, because I do think like implicit bias like exists, but I would go into a school in the Bronx and I'd see like that exact same behavior. And instead of it being like, wow, he's so outspoken, like he's that behavior would be, the reaction of the teacher would be like, you need to sit down. You need to get with the program.
Uh-huh.
You're misbehaving.
Uh-huh.
You need to get in line. You're not going to succeed unless you get in line.
Mm-hmm.
And this idea that you need to conform, whereas like in the white school, the kids were being taught like, you need to be assertive. You are exceptional. You're like, and that was sort of like really, really striking to me. Yeah. And it was regardless of the race of the teacher, to be perfectly honest. Like,
I absolutely agree with that. I truly believe that. I've had a teacher on a couple of episodes back, and we were talking about my thought process in these white schools where children are allowed to explore and learn and challenge themselves and grow, and they're fed all of this information as far as you can reach.
mm-hmm.
However, in predominantly Black or brown schools, the curriculum is only what the school district can afford. And what the school district can afford determines, we decide what we think you're worth, how much money we think you are, we have to educate you, I suppose. And it's either this or prison. So let's do both at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, I do think, though, there is a stereotype in New York that schools that are predominantly of color are not good. And that's not true. Like, so I think like that's also something that I've noticed with white parents. Like the school that I sent my kids to middle school at, none of my white friends were looking at. It was in our district, but the model that it had was exactly the same as all these schools they wanted to send their kids to.
Right.
So I was like, why am I going to try to get my kid into this like school that I know they're not going to get into because every kid wants to get, whereas there's this other school that has exactly the same model of education, has small classes. It's like a project-based curriculum. Really, the teachers are really engaged. The building feels like just amazing. Like, I mean, it ended up being like this amazing thing. This was like, became like a second family to me, my kids being at that school. But, when I put my kids in that school, I went back to talk. They asked me to come back and talk to my kids' elementary school about the school. And the questions I was getting were, what are the academics like? My kid's really good at math. Are they going to be challenged? Does your kid feel safe there? And like, this is a school that's like totally dorky. It's like all the kids who go to the school are like total nerds, right? Like it's a very nerdy school. Like, I mean, they have like 3 sports teams, and I think it's really hard for them to get kids to like join. But it's like, because like it's actually not that far from my studio. It's like probably like it's like about a quarter mile up the street.
Right.
But because like traditionally it's on the border of Carroll Gardens and Red Hook, and it really was and it ironically it has a junior school, so it's like one building with an elementary school and then a middle school through high school. The elementary school is this like super desirable progressive elementary school that like white parents in Brooklyn are like killing themselves to get their kids into, like killing themselves to get into, but they all opt out come middle school, because the middle school and high school until like District 15, which this school is in, like they did their desegregation a few years ago, was predominantly Black. So like these parents, once they got to the end of elementary school, would opt out, put their kids into either private schools, or there was like 3 desirable middle schools that were like, if your kid gets into one of these 3 middle schools, then you're fine. But they wouldn't send their kids to the middle school. And so there is like a real racial divide between, even in the building, where the elementary school is actually pretty well mixed, because they had purposely, the principal there had like purposely kept it, made an effort to make sure that there was like diversity. And when I mean diversity, I don't mean like, I mean like kids from all over the city. I don't mean like,
Mhm.
you know, I think like that's one funny thing I think about New York is when we talk about diversity, when people talk about diversity, they just mean Black people.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
but you know, the middle school was predominantly, you know, Black and Latino.
Right.
And so, and what I really appreciated it for my kids was that the administration there and the teachers, their mission was to those kids. So when my kids came in, it was like the first time where the administration and the teachers, they were there for them, but it was made very clear to me, like, you know what, this school is not, like, you're not going to take over the school and like make the school into like another white Brooklyn school. Like, this school is the way it is because these kids need it. And we're here for those kids. And that's our mission, is those kids, and to get those kids to college. Your kid's probably going to go to college. So,
Yeah.
you know, you can be here, but just know, like, your kid's not like the little, you know, focus of our school. Like,
Right.
So that was like, you know, I think really important for my kids to learn too, is like that, to get with the program, that like, you're not always going to be like, especially as white boys, to know like you're in a position of privilege, and that you don't deserve the things that are just offered to you.
That are, and I think that is something I want to applaud you as a white mother raising white sons to teach them this lesson. I really wish more white women would teach their sons this lesson.
Yeah, but I think it's also, there's a lot of white parents, especially in Brooklyn, who talk that, but they don't within their circle of friends.
No, because it's all performative.
Expose their children. So they'll say these things. And this is the biggest issue I have, is like, if your community does not look like the city, there is a serious problem. So like, if you don't have, you know, why are you living in New York if you're just like hanging out with people who look like you?
And sound like you and talk like you and have the same experience as you. You're not really learning anything. Your children are just parroting exactly what they see you doing.
Yeah.
And so we're continuing this segregated society. Oh yeah, we are all a melting pot, if you will, but only if we melt up to white.
Yeah.
We're only okay if we assimilate into white culture.
Yeah. Right. And I think like that goes to, you know, the whole conversation about immigration, right? And the, and what's the term that they were using recently about?
Which one? Proximity to whiteness?
No, about like Asian immigrants, and that they're
the model minority.
Model minority.
Yeah,
right?
The model minority.
Yep. Yeah. But I mean, I think and that is something that I, you know, do take pride in with my kids, is that them having this consciousness of race and not, I feel like they are more, because, you know, I'm saying all these things, but still, I was still raised with these feelings, right? So it's I have to like constantly be checking myself.
Right.
Because I really do think that like white people are racist. Like, yes, I think we all are.
Like, well, you know, what's really interesting is I have a theory about it's an indoctrination. And it is something that when we are born into this world, we are immediately indoctrinated into who is deemed important, who is worthy of all of the American dream, if you will.
Yeah.
And I could even boil it down to something super simple. If I asked you, what does a criminal look like? And that goes to what your white friends are asking about the school that your children are going to.
Yeah.
When they're little goobers, you guys have no problems at all seeing a little goober, a little child as a little child. But the
Yeah.
minute that little child grows up to middle
That
school
hits puberty.
age,
Mm-hmm.
the minute that happens, you go from seeing a little goober to a potential criminal. Not
Yeah.
because you think that child is a criminal, but because that child is Black, and somewhere in your head you've associated that with criminality because you've been taught to.
Yeah. And that's actually an interesting thing about my kids' school, right? Because many of the kids at that school live in, not all of them, but like some live in like the Red Hook houses, which aren't too far, or the Gowanus houses. So their families have been in the area. Like they sometimes are like grandparents who've like been, and the parent coordinator there is like, she lives in the Gowanus houses, and she, she is an activist within that community. But okay, so first of all, like there's that stereotype, right? Like people who live in public housing don't have jobs, right?
But
like
then you have to
that's a
unpack
whole
what's that
stereotype in
all about.
itself too.
Yeah, you
But
have, go ahead.
this whole neighborhood around Brooklyn has been so gentrified in the last like 30 years. So
Right.
you have these like white transplants who move into Carroll Gardens, and they see these kids walking to school. And I know from being in that school community that like those kids are all dorks who are into anime, right?
Mhm.
But those kids can't hang out in Carroll Gardens Park without like white parents calling the cops. They don't have any place to hang out in the neighborhood. Like there's no safe space. They can't hang out at the school because they have to leave school grounds at like 3:30 or something like that. And there's actually the school itself that my kids used to go to is it's a very, very safe school. But because it's so safe, their security guards only have like a certain level of authority. So it means that the NYPD has to support them. And how they support them is to park a paddy wagon outside the school. So even though this school is like super safe, sends like, I think like 98% of the kids go to college, what the NYPD is signaling to all these white transplants who move to the neighborhood is that we need to park a paddy wagon outside the school
to keep them in line.
And then so I would have these like, we would do this like annual like bake sale for the election every year. And people would come in and they'd be like, so I can't remember what the word they used to describe the kids. It was like hooligans or something like that. Like it was like hooligans, like they're like teenage boys. And then we also had an issue with like cops picking up kids for truancy. So like kids like just like coming to school late because they had a doctor's appointment and then getting picked up by police. And like this is like a big issue that I think a lot of people don't know about, is that Bloomberg, there used to be like truancy officers within the DOE, and then Bloomberg put that with the NYPD. So it meant that the NYPD is enforcing truancy in the New York City public school system, which means that kids who are skipping school may have their first like interaction with police because they're like skipping class. And so we would have these meetings with the NYPD and they would say like, oh, well, we're not picking up any more kids than at other schools. But they literally have the power to pick up a kid. If it's after 10 o'clock, they see a kid wandering around, pick up that kid, handcuff that kid, put them in the back of their police car and drive them to school. And like, I can't imagine the trauma that like a 14-year-old would feel having that happen to them. And it just, And when we, and this had happened several times with the school. And we had meetings with the precinct, and they were saying like, well, we just don't have records of this. And I don't know if this is true, but my impression was the cops who were picking up the kids weren't the truancy officers from the precinct, but cops just driving through the neighborhood, because Bloomberg gave this enforcement. So there was no record. They can't actually, these kids would be threatened. They're like, your name's going to go on the list. There's no list. There's no list. They're not being arrested. So there's no record of any of this at all, except the NYPD is allowed to pick up these kids. So these kids have no recourse at all. There's no record. They're just, and I do not think this is happening in other communities. I think that it's because Carroll Gardens is a predominantly white neighborhood, that some cop from Long Island is driving through it, sees a Black kid walking from the subway to school, and just thinks, oh, that kid shouldn't be in this neighborhood. What's that kid doing in this neighborhood? And that's really, it doesn't matter that that kid could live 3 blocks away. And his grandma could live 3 blocks away,
his grandma has been there for generations.
Exactly.
And the white people are now the new gentrified, the new colonizers.
Yeah.
And so now we're putting an interaction with the police onto 14-year-old boys. And that kind of trauma can set you on a path toward anything.
Yeah. I mean, to have your first interaction be for skipping class, really? You're going to handcuff a kid for how many times? It's, I've had white friends who have been like, yeah, my daughter didn't feel like going to school today, so I just let her skip.
Yep.
What's the worst is going to happen if your kids
Nothing.
Everybody skipped high school. That's part of growing up, and we're going to criminalize that.
That's something that has been happening with us for forever.
Yeah.
It's something that we don't see the cops as protectors.
Yeah.
And I've never done anything terribly illegal in my life. But even still, there are moments, and I'm damn near 50 years old, there are moments where I see a cop running by and I'm all like, am I okay?
Yeah.
But I know that I'm generally always okay, because most of the time I'm surrounded by white people, and that will be awkward for the cop.
Yeah.
That'll just be awkward for the cop. But what about those of us who aren't? And
having the talk, right? The talk as well.
Well, what's really interesting is in these rooms that you're in with these with your Upper East Side friend. I'm sorry, your Upper
Brooklyn. Brooklyn artsy liberals.
Yes, who are saying all the words that an ally should, but doing all of the things that I expect an ally to do. And the reason why I'm doing ally in air quotes is I have a theory about that. My theory is an ally has the opportunity to acquiesce. I can decide whether or not I'm going to participate in helping fix this problem. I can decide whether or not. I can say all the words I want. I can tell you I've written checks, even though I haven't. I can tell you all of these things so that you look at me like I'm on the right side of history, when I know full and well I am not.
Yeah. Well, and that points to performative activism, right?
Yeah. And that I'm exhausted with, because that's the kind of performative allyship we have had for 400 plus years.
Yeah.
Now, am I saying that there have not been white people in the fight with us? Well, there absolutely have been. Those are what I call accomplices. You understand your place.
Yeah.
And when you hear something, you say something.
Yeah.
You have no opportunity to acquiesce. You have no opportunity because you know that doing so perpetuates the stupidity.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of like what you're talking about has like how I had really complicated feelings last summer with the BLM protests,
Mm-hmm.
because I saw a lot of this performative activism,
Mm-hmm.
and actually, like, so my kids and I went on a walk. We were like walking we live in Flatbush, and we walked across Prospect Park to our old apartment, which is like in Park Slope. And we walked basically right into like this Black Lives Matter protest. And it was all these like white affluent Park Slope parents with their kids, all holding these signs. And I just knew like none of those parents would send their kids to school with Black kids.
Correct.
And it was just this, to me, there's that's sort of like the like, it's not enough to just go to a protest. That doesn't like, and you see this like in social media all the time, right? Like people going and they're reading some book, but like if you're not actually I guess like with like my Black friends, I felt like during the protest they were really hurting. And even looking at posts, like seeing what white people were posting, and I know that like white people were trying to like help, like by posting, but a lot of that was just I don't know, maybe you can speak to your feelings about this as well, but I felt like it was like re-traumatizing people. Like if you like, why are you posting this? Like I understand like you want your white friends to understand something, but why post like an act of violence towards somebody? And I felt like there was a lot of this kind of not like this othering still happening. So that although they felt like they were advocating for people, they were still othering those people. Like they still weren't people to them. They were bodies.
They were like bodies. It became, in some instances, I did see a lot of tragedy porn online. And what I saw something that last year when Black Lives Matter protests and what have you were happening, I didn't march or anything. I'm uncomfortable around large crowds of people. Yeah. I saw a white drag queen friend of mine, well, acquaintance of mine.
Yeah.
At a march in full beat.
Yeah.
With the Black Lives Matter sign. And when I looked at that, what I saw was you were turning the tragedy of my people into an event about you.
Yeah.
That's what I saw. And as Maya Angelou says, when you show me who you are, I believe you.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, maybe I'm just overreacting. So yeah. I waited. And here's this same queen on Fire Island, the whitest of all the gay islands.
I love Fire Island though. It's really pretty. But fit right in.
But here she is, like doing all her boom cacks. And at the end of it, throws out some tragedy porn about Black Lives Matter, making some statement. But again, this speaks more about you than it does about the subjugation of my people.
Yeah, and I think that it's also like not really like, I think that protest is important. I do think like, and I would talk to like my Black friends about this. And I did have one friend who's Latino, she's not Black, but she said to me, she was like, yeah, but at least like you're like if you go out, like we need everybody to get on board. So like feeling like you're performing is not a good, she was like, you should go, if like, you shouldn't let this feeling of you being in performance prevent you from supporting. And I thought that was like a good point. But I also felt like, among the arts community, there was like people who were like at every protest, like in the artists, like, like, because artists are like, I mean, that's like a whole other community that I'm part of, right? Where it's like very actively talking about decolonize this place and all this stuff, right? Like showing up for these like protests, like daily, like they were out like every day, and it was like, now we're doing Black trans rights, it's like there was like a different, now we're going on a bike protest, now we're doing, it's like I was getting these lists with like 30 protests a day, like
wow.
Yeah. But it was like, I just felt like they weren't doing anything outside of showing up for these protests, right? And I remember having a conversation with a photographer who was like covering the things. And he was talking about, like I'm trying to get like all of these, like, we need to like get all these community activists to get together and like do something. And I was just like, dude, there are already community organizations you can be working with. Like, you need to go out and get yourself fucking educated. Like, this didn't just happen. Like, you know what I mean? Like these are conversations that have been happening for 100 years. Like there are organizations that are working to desegregate the school. There are teens working to desegregate the school. Like, get on board and support your existing organizations. Like, you don't need to form your new one, and you don't and nobody needs to hear from you. Like, so, and that's like one of the things that I think really has been the hard thing for me as a white person, right? Is that centering, right? Because I think that as a white person, this privilege that in particular that I have is that people listen when I speak.
Yes.
So like when I was in college, like, I might be the bitch in class, but people are going to listen to what I have to say.
Yes.
And in even talking about this issue, I have to be very careful because I will talk about my opinions and my feelings and all this, right? So it's like centering me again. And I have to say, like, sending my kids to that school was a really good lesson for me. And I'm still working on it, like, still working on it. But in this feeling like, okay, you know what? It's not my turn to speak.
Right.
It's not my position to have a position on this.
And if you find it, what I'm loving about this this new world that we're creating is in these spaces, I'm seeing a lot of my white accomplices using their voices better. Meaning, oh, that's an interesting point. Let's hear what so-and-so has to say. I would like to use my platform to give this person a voice.
Yeah.
And that way you still carry your power, but you deflect it toward the voice that actually needs to be heard.
Yeah. Or calling out white people.
That's
actually, I think, the most important thing is like to actually, when somebody is doing that positioning, be like, hold on, we don't need to hear from you right now.
Stop your words. Now, there are times when my partner and I are together, and because he's a white fella, and we're talking, we're interacting with someone, and they've said something out of pocket. They've come out of their neck, and I choose whether or not I speak. I choose whether or not I'm going to correct you. Because my
Mhm.
thought process behind it is, if I make the decision to correct you of a microaggression, stereotyping, what have you, I'm not doing it for your benefit.
Yeah.
Has nothing to do with you. I'm doing it for the person who you say that to, who may inflict harm upon you. I'm more concerned about that person not getting a record.
Yeah.
So
That's
what
interesting.
if I choose to correct you, that's one
Yeah.
thing. Scott, on the other hand, if he hears it, or even if I'm not around or blah, 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 he will correct them
Yeah.
in a way that when a white person speaks to another white person, they don't usually get as nearly as offended or as uncomfortable is when I correct them.
Yeah.
When I correct them, because this has happened several times. I've corrected someone. I've tried to, it's like, look, I'm just giving you an education. You can take it or you can leave it. What happens is that that white person that I'm correcting looks to him. They look at him.
Yeah.
And Scott looks back at them and says, I'm not the one talking.
Yeah.
I'm not the one giving you this education.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And just in that moment, that's when I know.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a performance. That's just, this is just my life.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mhm.
And not having to, I mean, that was one of the things with BLM too, is I felt like I was like, there were certain points where I was trying to be a good ally,
Mhm.
but instead what I was doing is I was appropriating Black voices
Mhm.
to make my points. Like,
Mhm.
and orienting them around this idea, like I have very left-leaning politics,
Yes.
but I realized that at certain moments I was appropriating Black voices to suit my political agenda.
Yes.
And I think, especially amongst white liberal people, there is this feeling like, well, Black people should all agree with this because it's benefits them, right?
It just
So it's like,
benefits. Yeah. Mhm.
yeah, it's like, we're doing this for you. Like, this is for you. If you don't understand, you don't agree with this, well, it's because you just don't understand.
You just
Like,
don't
we're
understand
just
it.
doing this for you, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think like that was also something, because even like within my circle of friends, until my kids got into school, my circle of like friends were mostly of people of color, were artists, right? So we all have like sort of similar politics.
Mhm.
But when my kids went to middle school, it was like all of a sudden I had parent friends like who didn't look like me
Mhm.
and had different kinds of jobs,
Mhm.
and realizing like, oh, not everyone thinks like me.
Mhm.
So that too really changed my interactions with people as well. Because I realized like, oh, like I can still have feelings about something, but they can have their feelings about something and I can still be friends with them. And I don't need to impose my views on them. Like I can have very strong political feelings about something, and they can have various, like, for example, like vaccinations,
Right.
right?
Right.
Like a couple of like my Black friends still haven't been vaccinated. And I understand, like, whereas I was like, as soon as I could get vaccinated, I like, got vaccinated. As soon as like they were like,
Mhm.
kids 12 to 15 can get vaccinated, I was like, okay, I'm
Come on,
coming down.
boys. Come on.
I literally was like, we're going right now. Right. But like I have friends who still, like, there is like a historic legacy that I understand why they are
Mhm.
hesitant. And I don't think that they're not educated, Do I think it's wrong? Probably. But at the same time, it's not my body.
And it's not your choice.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And I appreciate that, because what you're doing is widening your circle of influence. And what I'm learning is when I'm having this conversation, and most people's circle of influence is they all look strangely enough alike and believe in the same things politically and basically all do the same things for a living or around the same things or what have you. And
Yeah.
so those interactions reflect how you vote. They reflect who you advocate for, who you
Yep.
have humanity for, who you have empathy for, those kinds of interactions. And honestly, I think that in order for us to fix or even to begin to heal all of this tragedy is we have to open up our circles of influence and fill our lives with people who don't have the same background as us.
Yeah.
Because
And I think, yeah, I agree.
I think that, like you made mention of the moms in your son's middle school. It took me many, many years. I don't know why I didn't know this, but I always slightly intelligently knew that women made less money than men. I knew that, right?
Yeah.
But then when I saw it on paper,
Yeah.
and it hit me that Black women make 62 cents to the white man's dollar.
Yeah.
Then it all made complete, like it all like clicked for me. So you have Black mom
Yeah.
working many, many jobs, trying to raise her children in an environment of all the odds are stacked against that child.
It's also like empathy, I think, for what I think is really interesting in terms of parent, like mothering in the United States, is that, you know, if you talk to the Republican Party, there's this value of the stay-at-home mother, right? But that stay-at-home mother is white. Once she's single, once she's Black or Latino, then suddenly it's, why did you have these kids?
Why did you have these kids?
You can't afford these kids. Like, why are you on welfare? Like, there's no, like, whereas like, if you've got 3 kids, staying home with your kids is a job to make sure your kids go to college. It might make more sense for you to be on public assistance so that you can, if you don't have somebody who's like a spouse who can support you, it might make more sense for you to be on public assistance. So you can make sure your kids go to school. You can make sure somebody's home when they get home from school. You can keep them on track, but that's not valued unless that kind of labor is not valued unless it's white and it's affluent.
Well, yes, you have to have a man that takes care of you because rich white women don't do anything.
Well, I think like that's,
and I don't mean
but I think
as
that this also goes into like America, and that's like a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
But values of unpaid labor, right? And the fact that the reason why white women are able to go to work, right, is on the backs of immigrant women, Black women, Latino women.
Yes.
And that work is not valued. It is a real job, right? Like those women do not get paid, right? And then, but if like a woman, I mean, I talk about this with my friends all the time, but I think that that idea of domestic work not being valued, right? And it even goes down to what you were saying, this idea like that the stay-at-home, the affluent white mom is not doing anything when she's at home, which she is doing. So I would say she is doing something because that's how those PTAs work, right? Like those PTAs, like 321, where my kids went to elementary school, they raised like $1.4 million a year for that school. And who was doing that? It was stay-at-home moms. They make their full-time job supporting their kids, that's how their kids are like getting into those schools, how their kids are like getting their first jobs, how their kid, like they are like holding their kids' hands through the whole thing. But we don't value domestic work, and we value it even less when we, we basically are, when we like make these invisible women, right? Because they become invisible, I think. like that there's this whole illusion of affluent working women that like they're having it all. They're not having it all. There's a whole shadow behind them of other women who are picking up the slack.
Right. And while these affluent women are raising millions and millions of dollars for this school that their affluent children get to participate in, being further segregated from the rabble who can't afford to go there, even though that neighborhood originally was housed by Black and brown communities.
Yeah. And I think like that's a thing too, right? This idea, and I think it does kind of go to American identity. Like I do think that it's cultural in this idea of individualism, that I need to be doing the best for my child. So my child needs this. I'm going to work for my kid's school because I want the best for my child, and not recognizing that this school that's like half a mile away doesn't have even erasers for kids. You know,
but
like
that's not
don't
important.
even have
My child
pencils.
doesn't go there. My child doesn't go there. That's not important.
And
those parents should be doing better. Those parents should be doing what I'm doing. Well, if the mother wasn't sitting at home with all those kids, she could be doing what I'm doing.
Yeah.
But
and honestly, even I mean, like even, and I'm sorry to like interrupt you, but like even with like nonprofit stuff, like, you know, there's all these nonprofits in the city, like arts nonprofits, and I work for them. And I have like, it does give me a bit of pause, but there's this idea like, you know, but we have all these programs. Like if your kid is like free tutoring, we have a summer program. We have this art program that's free. That's for kids who like, you know, don't like, that are poor. And like, and then there's all these like wealthy people who donate money to these charities, right? And so that's problematic in a way too, because this idea of like the nonprofit space, right, is being directed by like white people deciding like what Black kids need. Yes. Like, oh, your mom doesn't know what you need. What you need is this arts program, and you need to learn like this Western canon of art, right? Like, I mean, this is part of my struggle in teaching art history to college to like a bunch of like Black and brown kids, where I'm like, let's learn about Gothic architecture. Like, give a crap, right?
Yeah, right.
But you know, like, seriously, like who does? I mean, it's interesting if you're interested in architecture, I guess, but there's like all sorts of, anyway, I'm digressing. But so that I find is like problematic, right? And it's also like, I'm going to get a tax write-off for like forcing these kids who aren't my kids, but like, it's charitable. Like I'm giving, right? Like, look at me, I'm charity. But then also as a parent, right? You have to be privileged in a way. And when I mean privileged, I don't necessarily mean white, right? But you have to be English speaking. You have to be educated to a certain extent. You need to be able to negotiate technology. There's all these things that go into you, finding that program.
Right.
Because if you're an immigrant and you're getting all these emails from your school, you're not even going to know what they say, right? Like, so how are you going to know about these programs? Then you have to like have enough time. Like you can't be working 3 jobs. You have to have time to research them, to send in the applications, to make sure that your kid is going, figuring out how to get your kid there in the first place, figuring out how to get your kid picked up. There's all these things that go into it. So it's like, it's not enough for a rich person to be like, I'm going to create this after school program, like where we're going to learn how to make frescoes. Like, you know, it's like
how in the hell, what is it supposed to teach me? And, you know, I've been in conversations with people, and they're like, you know, we give to charities, and we did yoga for underprivileged youth.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, I teach in these programs, so it's like I do see the value in them. Like, but yeah, it's and these are all things that should just be taught during the school day, right? Like these are all things that should be available to every kid. Like, and even like, you know, and I can go on this for hours, like about the New York City public school system and how the admissions process to middle school and high school is so, I mean, it's purposely, this is all like segregation is built into that system.
Oh, absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
that, last year, both my kids just started high school this year. And first of all, there's like this circle of schools that like white affluent parents are like, these are the good schools.
Mm-hmm.
Any other schools outside of this are not so good. So I'm not even going to look at those schools. These are the schools. Like, so if my kid doesn't get into these schools, then we'll send them to private school, right?
Oh, okay.
That's the option, right? Like if they don't get into that, well, then there's no option. We have to like spend $50,000, $70,000 a year, right? Anyway,
that sounds
I don't have that kind of money. So like,
right.
But that's the mentality. Yeah, that's really the mentality. And they hire advisors. Like there is a woman in Brooklyn, she charges, I think it's like $300 an hour for you to meet with her and her to run through different public schools to walk you through the admissions process for middle school and high school to help you strategize your list of admissions. There are, a lot of these like charitable programs are portfolio programs to get your kid into, and there are free ones to get into specialized schools. But again, you need to know about these things in order to get them in. There's like a whole set of specialized schools where like kids have to write essays, kids have to put together portfolios. Like who is doing all that stuff with like
who's doing this?
You can't do it. If you have 3 jobs, you can't do that. If you are a new immigrant, how are you even going to be able to like, there's something like 550 New York City high schools.
Okay.
So if you just moved here, right? How are you going to know what schools are good for your kid and which ones like are bad, right? Like when you look at the list, they look great. So like for affluent white parents, they rely on each other, right? So they all send their kids to the same schools. Like I could list off those schools in a second. And then there's these like art schools, right? So one of my kids goes to art and design. And so last year we went through the audition process. Like they're auditioning 12, 13-year-old kids, right? And I'm walking into these environments, the kids need a portfolio, right? So my kid, he's lucky, he has a mom as an artist. So even though he went to this public school that doesn't really have an art program, like I worked with him on weekends, like he did, I'll say like he did do most of the work himself, like probably more so than other kids, but he still had the privilege of having a parent who was able to buy him materials, like tell him what he should do, right? Because I teach art, so
right.
And then also put together the portfolio so it looked all nice, right? Like it looked like professional. We were walking into these auditions and it's predominantly white parents, predominantly college educated. They're there with their kids. They've got these portfolios. They've had their kid in, some of them had their kids in like art programs for 2-3 years to prep for this. They also like send to get their kids into like the Stuyvesants and stuff like that. All of those kids get test prep. I mean, that's part of the racial disparity there is like the test prep. So like these white parents I know will have their kids in test prep from 6th grade through 8th grade to prep for the SHSAT. And the reason, and then, I mean, it's the same thing if you go to Chinatown or you go to like Flushing, there are these like testing kind of like people really prioritize sending their kids to these test prep places. So you have these poor immigrant parents who like, they come from countries where like there's this high stakes testing. So like they'll like spend their last dollar to get their kids like test prepped, right? But if you're just living in the city, you assume like, oh, it's like equal, like they should be like actually learning the stuff in school. So if they go do the SHSAT, if they did really well in school, if they're at the top of their class, then they should do really well in the SHSAT. But the SHSAT, the stuff on it is not taught in school. So your kid could have straight A's and flunk the SHSAT. Even though your kid may be super smart and be a great writer, great at math, but like most adults would fail the SHSAT because of it, you have to be taught to take it. And so that in itself already creates this inequity, right? And then you have these specialized schools where you have a kid who has to write an essay, or a kid who has to make a portfolio, or like you go into like LaGuardia, right? And we all imagine like LaGuardia Performing Arts, it's like fame school, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like kids walking in with this natural ability. No, how are you going to do a ballet, like a ballet exam? Like, how are you going to go in for an audition for ballet unless you've had like 2-3 years of ballet class?
Jesus.
Right? So like, who are the kids whose parents can afford for them to
All
take
of this.
Yeah. And granted, there will be people who like be like, well, there's like these after school programs, YMCA, you know, like there's these nonprofits that are like providing dance in Harlem for like kids, or like Alvin Ailey has its program and New York. Well, okay. Yeah, those exist, but you have to have the resources to seek them out.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have the time to show up for the auditions for those things, because they're all auditions.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to do all the paperwork. You have to like be able to get your kid to those lessons. And that's all outside of school time. So, you know, why like, so it, you know, and there's a really great teen organization called Integrate NYC. And like and they're doing these protests outside of schools right now because, you know, Bloomberg, one of the things that he did was like chop up all these like quote unquote failing schools and turn them all into these like very specified schools, which are mostly like bull crap. Like, you know, like the High School of Hospitality and Hotel Work or something like that. Or like, you know, I have some of my BMCCs because I teach at BMCC. I've had students who read to like, you know, some crappy high school in the Bronx that was like one hallway of like a building and was supposed to be like about medical, like the medical, like was supposed to be like medical training, but they never took a class in it, right? Because he like cut up all these schools. So then you have several different administrations within a building. So you have like 5 different schools in one building. You have 5 different principals, 5, you know, like how it's just like, why? Like, and this is the whole idea behind this is like school choice, and school choice in itself, I believe, is the root of segregation in the New York City schools.
This all sounds, I'm exhausted just from hearing the story of all of this. Sounds exhausting.
I'm like obsessed with this.
It sounds because everything that you're putting on like all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting here in my Harlem apartment and I'm thinking, so this is what these teenage children who live in my complex have had to endure.
Oh yeah. I mean, there's a reason why they're so stressed.
On top of all of the heavily policing, on top of all of this.
Yeah.
And then, oh my gosh. So then these kids go out and they're forced to compete. They're forced to compete.
And they don't even know. I mean, this is the thing too, right? Like when my kids were in 5th grade, they were obsessed. Like we were obsessed with like finding the right middle school. Like their 5th grade and like their 8th grade, it was like a full-time job for me. Like, and parents, like affluent parents will talk about it being like a job. It's a job. And then I would go teach in like Harlem and the Bronx. And I'd be like, so where are you going to go to middle school? What middle schools are you looking at? And they'd be like, I don't know. I'm just going to like cause they're like, I'm just going to go to that school down the block, like that everybody goes to. So it's like, I would say for probably a lot of the kids living around you whose parents can't orient this, they're just falling through the cracks. And the thing is, it's not their parents' fault, because why should their parent, like when you send your kid, like when I was growing up, you went to your local school, you went to your local high school, you graduated, you went to college, you could go to the best college, right? Like depending on how well you did at your high school. It wasn't like there was like much difference between one high school and the other high school. except that they were in like different neighborhoods, right?
Well, mine was segregated, but yeah.
And it's different in the US. But I'm saying like for people from different countries, like unless you're like from a really like competitive test taking country, like I think a lot of countries in like Southeast Asia and in East Asia, like there is that testing culture. But like Western Europe and like Canada and Scandinavia, it's like you just go to the school, you'll be fine. Like
you're fine.
yeah, I mean, it's okay. It's cool. You can flunk out a few times. You'll make it up, you know, like,
You'll be fine. It'll be all right.
Puberty is hard enough, right?
Yes.
Instead, we're taking these kids who are like 13 and being like, okay, we have to strategize right now. Like, what school are you going to go to? What are the admissions? Where do they send their kids? Do they send them to Harvard? Like, we need to figure this out. Like, I want my kid to go to Harvard, so they have to go to this school. And if they don't get into Beacon, like there's this whole like Beacon is like the school that like Brooklyn white parents want their kids to go to. And they'll be like, well, if they don't go into Beacon, then like, oh, then where are we going to send them? We're going to send them polyprep. Oh, or like, maybe we could get on the waiting list for like, it's just like it's insane. It's like totally, totally insane. And then you have these kids and, you know, this goes for like affluent white kids too, right? This enormous amount of pressure put on those kids, right? Whereas there's this idea like if you end up at the Black school, you failed, right? For a white kid. If you didn't end up at that fancy, like selective public school, and you end up just being stuck at like a regular school, like you're not going to go to Harvard. Like your whole like scholastic career is shot. Like, so just forget about all that.
Welcome.
So that's like the amount of pressure that like white parents are putting on their kids, right? Like there's this enormous pressure putting on. And I mean, if you can think about like with like coronavirus, it's like these kids dealing with both of those things at the same time. Because they still, even like during the pandemic, like they made a few changes. So I think with like the middle school admissions, I think they made it lottery based. But the high school was still the same. So even during coronavirus, kids were like uploading portfolios online because they couldn't go school to school to like, yeah, it's insane. And this is like why our school system is so segregated.
And then why our colleges are still so problematic, and then why our workspaces are still so problematic, and why our lives are continuing to be so segregated.
Yeah,
it's all by design. And what's happening is these affluent white parents, it sounds like you're setting up, you're not raising children, you're raising mini moguls. And I don't hear none of that sounds joyful.
no,
None of that sounds joyful. When do the children actually get to be children?
Well, I think like that's one thing with white parents is this idea that your kids need to be scheduled, right? Like that there's this whole like overscheduling of kids, right? And that we need to control our children's lives so that we can guarantee success, right? Which means connecting them to certain people. And the thing that we don't understand as white parents is that these connections that we're trying to connect our kids to, other people don't even have, like remotely even, like we're worried about positioning our kids. Those people can't even be positioned, right? I mean, and I've been thinking a lot about it. Like, I've been thinking a lot about it since, you know, my husband and I are separated, and this idea of dating and talking to my single mom friends who are Latino and Black, right? And how even in that circle, like my circle of people I can date is so much wider than theirs. Because, you know, a white lawyer, he'll take me out for dinner.
Yeah.
He's not going to take a friend of mine who also is college educated, totally brilliant, but she doesn't look like who he wants to take into that space. So, you know, or he sees, I shouldn't even say he doesn't want to take her into that space, but who he does not see fitting into his space, right? So this idea of like fitting in, I mean, it is like a passing, right? It's still a passing. And it's something that's also something I think about a lot, because as an immigrant, right? Except I speak without an accent. And I remember when I was undocumented, white people would say shit to me that I just like, they would be like, I don't understand. Like, why can't you work? And I'd be like, explain the whole thing. And they'd be like, oh, that's so, they should just, let's give you papers. And I'd be like, well, like, what about these people? And they'd be like, oh, but you're like Canadian. It's like, it's just the same. You're like us. Like they would always be like, you're like us. Right. And that's something that's really apparent to me too, is that I actually have access to communities just by virtue of the way that I look, that people, Americans, like many Americans don't have. Because, you know, and that, so in some ways, like I am perceived as more quote unquote American because in those people's idea of what makes an American is someone who is white, and is blonde, and is, you know, all these things, which is, and it's, and like that goes back to what I was saying about Canada, right? This feeling of like, oh, we'll let you into our country because we're so benevolent, right? Like, but you'll never really be like Canadian.
You'll never be really Canadian.
Yeah, I mean, like, well, you are Canadian, but you're like Iranian Canadian, right? Like, but this, yeah, and so I think like that goes into it as well, like this idea of like, even when, you know, with Trump, this idea of like the make America great again, right? I mean, we could go, I mean, that's probably a conversation you've had a lot, but like this idea of like, and I won't even go there, but I was just gonna say, but this idea of like, what does America look like?
White.
And the majority of Americans are like minority, right? The majority is the minority. Like, and we live in cities, right? We like, there are more people living in New York, and there's more people living in like LA than there are in like rural bumfuck like Iowa, right? But those people are more American, like, you know what I mean? It's like,
but the idea, no, it has, you know, what I'm finding, it's not about the geography. What it is about the mindset.
Yeah.
And even when I asked you, when did you learn about race? Do you know that to date, and I think I've had damn near 30 conversations to date, I've never had a white person include themselves as a race.
I think that, yeah, because we're the baseline, right?
Yeah, you're in our head.
Actually, you know what? I do have a story, and this is kind of interesting. Okay, so this would be the first time I realized about race, and I don't know why this didn't bring up, and it's not something I really talk about.
Okay.
So when I was about 10 years old, I was at a track meet. And I think this is actually, it's really influenced the way that I still think about race right now. And I had like known some Black kids growing up, like in my church and in my school, but I was always like the one Black kid, right? Like, and I wasn't particularly close to them. They weren't really in my circle of friends. Like they were sort of more acquaintances. And so I was at this track meet, and these girls were bullying a friend of mine. And so I called them out. I can't even remember why I called them out. I don't remember what I said, but I called them out. And then a couple of hours later, one of the girls, and she was Black, came up to me and said, I heard you called me the N-word. And I said, no, I don't, someone might have called you that, but it wasn't me. And she said, well, I heard you called me the N-word. And I was like, I didn't, right? So over the course of the day, this girl kept on coming and confronting me and saying this. And I was like, I have never used that word. Like, I've never used that word. I've never said that. And then how it ended was her, at the end of the day, our whole school was sitting on the stands. And she came up behind me on the bleachers and said again, "You called me this." And I was like, "No." And she punched me in the face and I fell down the bleacher. So I passed out for like 5 minutes. I don't know why I didn't tell you about this. Anyway, so this is like a very significant moment of my childhood. So here was the thing is like that, you know, immediately I was like taken to the hospital and I actually couldn't even tell them what had happened because I was so like they were like, "Well, what did she say you called her?" And I was like, this word. I was like, I don't even think I could say the N word. I was like, she said I called her this word. Like I couldn't even articulate the word because it was so horrifying to me. But my parents were on vacation and my grandmother was watching me and I didn't want her to know this happened because I thought that she would get really upset. And also my aunt worked for the school board and I really didn't want to make a big deal about it because in the back of my head, I felt like someone must have called her this or else she wouldn't have been so angry. Like maybe one of her friends said it, like, because, you know, we were like the age of girls where you're all like, ah, right?
Yeah.
Like maybe somebody had told her I'd said this, or maybe she just was looking for a fight. Like I didn't know, but I was like, if someone did call her that, like that's awful. And so I just wanted to like hide it. And I had this giant shiner. So I went home and I was like covering it with makeup. And then my brother went to Boy Scouts and he came out at Boy Scouts. Like, so he came home and he was like, "I heard blah, 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 blah." So then it like chaos ensued because my aunt worked for the school board. And so then all of a sudden I had to have all these meetings with people about it. And I remember, and this is the conscious race part, is I remember sitting with my vice principal and him saying to me, "Do you know what the word," and he said the word, "means?" And I was like, "No, like I know it's a bad word, but no, I don't know what it means." And he said, "It means trash." He said, "It means trash. How would you feel if somebody said you were trash?" And I was like, "Oh, but I didn't say it." And he said, "You look like you would have said it." And that was like the first instance where I was like, oh, so it doesn't really matter if I said it or not. I look like to him the kind of person who would say it. And it was like, and it kind of followed through the school where, you know, I had a couple of friends who were of color and they believed I said it. And so it was this instance where for years, like I was afraid I was gonna like bump into this girl, like even though she went to like a different high school across town. I was like, I literally thought I'd be like walking down the street and this girl would like turn around and be like,
it could punch you one more time.
And I remember going to like a skating competition and like her friend, her like tough friend who's with her, like was like competing against me. And the entire time I was like, had my head down. Like I really felt guilty. Like I felt like it was my fault that this had happened. And I think it did give me this consciousness in race because I felt like, I mean, I knew I hadn't said it. And I knew that when I called her out, it had nothing to do with race. It was like about her being a bitch because she was being a bitch.
Right.
She was being mean. But it was one of those things where I realized like, this can happen.
Yes.
And it can cause harm to people. And I may not have said it, but I feel guilt. I still felt that guilt, even though it may not have even happened, but I, for years, felt this guilt. And I think like it really did frame the way I thought about these things in my position of privilege in an early way that I don't think would have come to me until like, especially with like BLM, I feel like a lot of white people are sort of like finally figuring that out. But I think that experience young, and I feel really uncomfortable telling my Black friends about. I think I've told them all at this point, but like, but it is a story that I always felt like what I told Black friends that they might be like, you probably did see it. Like, I really felt like that for like years.
And hearing it and hearing you tell it and hearing the aftermath of it, you probably didn't say it, but I understand why young sis came over and said, I get the whole story.
Mhm.
And much like my 8-year-old realization,
Yeah.
that's I'm very happy you told me that story. Thank you very
Oh,
much.
you're welcome. But it is one of those things, I think it's a hard thing because even though, you know, I did not say that,
Mm-hmm.
there's still implicit bias, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So maybe I wouldn't have called her out. If she had
And
been white, maybe I wouldn't have called her out, right?
maybe you wouldn't have.
I don't know. Well, I probably would have. I probably would have because I was a loudmouth. But
Yeah.
at the same time, I think that I had a sort of assertiveness that came from my privilege, right? That I felt like I had this ability to speak and that people should hear what I was saying.
Yeah.
Like that I almost was like the police, right? Like it was
Yeah.
like, it was totally like the Karen. Like I was the Karen of the track meet of like,
Well, 10-year-old
like,
Karen got punched in the face.
yeah, I was the Karen. I was the Karen of the East York track meet. You can't talk to people like that. That's not very nice.
You're like, okay, Karen, I got you.
You know, so
oh, that's good.
but yeah, so maybe that's why I felt guilt about it, even though I never said it. But I think it's really interesting to me that I felt so much guilt and still feel so much guilt for something I didn't say, which is weird, right? Like that's weird. Like, and I think that might also just be like from my family, and like my mom always making me feel guilty for shit I didn't do. But like, like I'm the kind of person who, if somebody's like, I'm missing like $50. Have you seen the $50? I'm like, oh no, I didn't.
No. Would you like $50? I can give you $50. I didn't take it, but here's $50.
I'd be like, did I take it? I might have taken it. I don't know.
I don't know. Did I take it? I don't think I took it. Here's $50 though. I don't want you to be without $50.
Just in case I took it while I was in a fever dream. But I often thought about that girl because I think she ended up getting suspended for 4 days because my aunt was so outraged. And I had that privilege of having an aunt who was like worked for the school board, right? So she was like on a mission. She was like, nobody's gonna punch my niece and like get away with this. But I remember at the time feeling like, oh my God, this is terrible for this girl. Like, what if someone really did call her this? And now she's getting suspended? Like that didn't seem right to me.
And that set the tone.
Even, and I think maybe that's what I felt guilt about was that she got suspended and that it could have happened. And yeah, I became like the source of her anger. Like, you know, like it was targeted towards me, but that it could have really happened. But it was kind of a rough year for me because it was like, I guess because I was kind of like a bitch, like, but that it was shocking to me that my classmates would think that I would say something like that.
Well, it's probably because you were a bitch.
I know, but I wasn't a racist. Well, no, I was.
Like
I said, we all said like, right, like all white people are racist. But I said, I guess I would say that I wasn't a racist white bitch who would say that.
Right, but they are like, well, she's a bitch, and she probably, well, you know, bitches say that. So
just say things. Yeah, but that was really hard though, I have to say, like with a couple of my friends who were of color, seeing that they would think that I would go there was really upsetting to me because it felt like, oh, we're not really friends. And I think that was like a really hard thing for me to acknowledge as a kid, like, oh, like, and if we're not friends, I think now I realize like, oh, maybe we weren't friends because I came from this position of privilege and was negotiating our relationship, you know. And this is why I was saying before, like I have a really hard time talking about race in terms of Canada, because I think in my childhood, I had this sort of like benevolent dictator idea.
Exactly.
Race, right? So like, even in these interactions with people I thought were my friends, I'm not sure I was wholly friends with them. Do you know what I mean? In the way I think of friendship,
Right.
So, and possibly they saw that and legitimately. But yeah, so that would be my first instance of being conscious of race. There you go. You have your story. It's a really good one.
I am such a, I thank you.
You're welcome.
This was such an amazing conversation.
Oh, glad. I can hang out with you all day.
I know, right?
You want to go get drinks now?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'm a better person for having had this conversation with you.
Me too.
Thank you. And I appreciate you.
Thank you. And thank you for not entirely putting me on the spot. I was like,
you know what?
I was like ready. I was like, okay, but I think it's important to have these conversations. And I think as white people, it's really important for us to be challenged.
Mm-hmm. And the way I see
it is a growth thing, like you were saying before, right?
Yeah,
like we're not perfect.
I see the world is like, we have conversations and we have the opportunity when I'm in a conversation with someone, if I want you to actually hear me, I can antagonize you and you can antagonize me. We can have a conversation, and in that conversation, we get nuggets from one another.
Yeah.
We get realizations from one another, and then we get a different perspective. And in those moments, we get to learn and grow.
Yeah, and I think having a safe space, I mean, it's kind of, it does, it's a double-edged sword, right? But I think having a safe space to acknowledge your, and I don't mean you, I mean just people in general, your bias,
Mm-hmm.
and admitting feelings that are uncomfortable, like my feelings about that incident, it still makes me uncomfortable to think about it, right?
That's
because
good.
But it was a good experience to have, because it made me realize, like, oh, with my own children, where am I, and then also just putting yourselves into these situations where you may be uncomfortable and you may get called out for stuff, but making it a safe enough space that you can get called out and move beyond.
Mm-hmm.
So there's not this, there's not like that you can come back in.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Like, yeah. Because that's really the only way we're going to really, I think, get past this, is if, you can allow, like, and that's also not my decision to make either, right? As a white person. It's not.
No, it's not. But what
Yeah.
it is as a white person, knowing that you have privilege,
Mm-hmm.
you can either weaponize or accomplicize.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a word. Your privilege.
Yeah.
You can either use it against our cause, or use it toward a future that is going to be better.
Yeah. Well, but also what is my perception of a better world, right? Because that's also completely framed by my own experience.
And that experience is framed by you widening your perspective. Okay, I'm going to stop recording now.